All right. I'm still seeing a few people coming in, but I will go ahead and get started by telling everybody I hope you're having a good morning and that you're all doing well. It's good to see you all here today. I'd like to welcome all the attendees and the presenters to this session, the first of our concurrent sessions for the day, session 1.1. Working together, developing better practices for collaborating in a remote and hybrid workplace at NC State. I have activated live transcript. So if you can't see it and you would like to, down at the bottom of your screen, just toggle to under live transcript, toggle to show subtitle, and that should activate it for you. Emily Jones and I are co-moderating this session today. If during the Q&A portion of the session, you would like to pose an anonymous question, please feel free to chat one of us and we will pose it to the presenters. Also, if during the presentation you have any technical issues or other questions, please feel free to contact she or I, and we will help you out. That said, I will turn things over to our group of presenters and let them introduce themselves and get us started.
Right. Thank you, Amy. Well, good morning, everyone. Welcome to a session to kick off this conference. And the focus is working together. And as Amy mentioned, you can submit questions anonymously, but also if you just want to drop them in the chat, we'll make sure to address some of those first at the Q&A part of this session. So you are able to access our slides today if you want to hang on to them. And if you are interested in gathering the full report of all the better practices that we recommended for remote and hybrid work and learning, it's about 70 plus pages. You can also get that link by going to this link, and hopefully one of my co-presenters will drop this link in the chat as well. So first, who are we? We are all members of the Collaborative and Remote Work Task Force, and we'll talk about what that means in just a moment. But my name is Hillary Fox, and outside of that task force, I'm a research librarian for agricultural and environmental sciences.
Hey, I'm Kevin Beswick. My pronouns are he, him, and I'm the associate head of the Digital Library Initiatives Department.
I am Robin Davis. My pronouns are she and her, and I am a user experience librarian.
And I'm Lynn Whittenberger, also she, her. I'm the associate head for acquisitions and discovery with a monographs focus.
Great. So now that you know who we are, it's also important to recognize that everything we're about to talk about, it wasn't just developed by the four of us. Since March of 2020, everything that you're about to see a product of is the efforts of numerous other staff within the NC State University libraries. So a quick overview of where we're going. In addition to talking about some of the best practices that we've developed, we're going to talk about how we got to that point and the identified focus areas. So we're going to kick things off with going over a background of what we're calling the CRWTF, the Collaborative and Remote Work Task Force. Then we'll hop into the process that we use to gather feedback and communicate results about the better practices for hybrid work that we developed. Then we'll transition to a high-level review of the deliverables that we made, followed by the impact of this group's work. Okay, so I'll turn things over to Robin.
So the Collaborative and Remote Work Task Force, which we've abbreviated slightly as CRWTF, occurred in two rounds. On the first round, over the course of the year 2020, we addressed recommendations for remote work. So how did this task force get started? Well, even pre-pandemic, library staff wanted to make improvements to how we communicate because staff were experiencing meeting fatigue. Here at NC State, we are a very meeting-heavy culture. It's because we really value collaboration and we're really good at it. But at the same time, some staff were experiencing meeting fatigue and feeling like they didn't have enough time to work on the things that we were holding meetings about. So the sense of meeting fatigue, combined with the pandemic and the rapid shift to online work, created an urgent need for a shift in our meeting culture.
Yeah, so in addition to reviewing our meeting culture, one of the ways that helped us identify other areas for us to focus on, in addition to meeting culture, was our quality of work life survey. And that was distributed at the start of the pandemic and then several times throughout the pandemic. But this survey helped us as a library identify challenges as well as the positive aspects of working during the pandemic. And from the survey, we found that the work from home option, especially during the remote period, this helped people feel more of a work-life balance, but communicating with one another, that was still a priority, especially when it came to the preferences to communicate over email or to have meetings on Zoom. So this told us that with collaboration, like especially with meetings, that communication practices and how we participate in meetings, the library really has the potential to optimize how we're interacting with each other and how we're using collaborative technologies. Additionally, in addition to looking at the meeting practices, this wellness survey, it helped the collaborative and remote work task force identify focus areas for other places for us to develop better practices. And we looked at a lot of things, but of interest the most to this group were meeting practices, time management, as well as inclusion and communication practices within meetings. So to give you a sense of how the libraries responded to these survey results, as well as the pandemic, as Robin mentioned, we started with the first iteration of the Collaborative Remote Work Task Force, which was focused pretty much exclusively on remote work. And this group, we were charged by the Senior Vice Provost and Director of our libraries, and our task was to develop recommendations about tools and practices to best manage the short-term situation of remote work, because remember, at that time, we didn't really know how long we'd be here. But then we were also asked to consider a deeper set of recommendations and considerations to support remote and asynchronous work in the future. Then fast forward a little bit to spring 2021 through summer 2021, the second iteration of this group came back together to look at how our remote practices could be transformed into hybrid practices for the long term. And the reason why we revisited some of those practices is because there's different considerations you have to take into account for a hybrid situation compared to a remote. So of particular importance to this group, the things that we revisited were meeting practices, time management, and inclusive communication practices.
If you are a visual person like me, here's the timeline of when each round of the task force was active and what we did. And you will notice that in each round, we asked for staff feedback, either through a survey or other methods. We released an initial report or a draft. We incorporated that staff feedback and then shared final recommendations. So for round one of the task force in 2020, the focus was on remote meeting practices. And then round two in 2021, the focus was on hybrid work practices.
Yeah, and as Robin mentioned, every stage of all this, we gathered feedback. So we wanted to highlight what some of those feedback opportunities looked like. The first way that we sought feedback to help us formulate our recommendations was through our SWAP sessions, which stands for Share with a Peer. And these are library presentations where anyone within the libraries can join on different topics. But when we were doing a SWAP, we focused on meetings and remote work, and asked people what their meeting practices were and asked them to provide feedback on some of the recommendations we were coming up with. We also included open discussion sessions. So in some ways, like focus groups where anyone could drop in. And through those, we talked about active listening and communication and how to be inclusive with initially remote work practices. And then when we sent out a draft of our recommendations, we also asked for a lot of feedback on that. And the things that we were seeking feedback for from staff were things about concerning a meeting assessment or managing the life cycle of your team or committee, managing time and calendars so you could better balance your work commitments, and then also just some general staff communication guidelines.
So our initial recommendations focused on the subject of meetings and meeting culture, like we've said, in a remote environment, because those were things that, that every staff member was experiencing on a regular basis. And as we mentioned before, we were already experiencing meeting fatigue even before the pandemic. So based on the workplace engagement surveys, we could tell that our colleagues really believed that this was an area ripe for improvement. Since we were releasing our recommendations in the months following the start of the pandemic, we also addressed norms that had developed since that March, especially regarding the use of Zoom, which we all got used to right away. And when we released our recommendations, we shared a talking point slide deck for teams to use as a basis for conversations on team meetings and norms. And we also solicited staff feedback as well. So again, there's that theme of asking for staff feedback the whole time that we were putting together these recommendations. So our final report, which we shared with everyone in December 2020, included 3 main sections: meeting practices, including inclusive meeting behaviors, better and best practices for Zoom, how to collaborate remotely, a time management section, including focus time and meeting-free days, and a section about taking a step back. So that's evaluating our communication practices, assessing meetings, and then how to audit team and committee and team committees.
Okay, so now that you know what we created for our first round of deliverables for remote work, we want to talk about how do you actually implement these practices across an entire library system, and what steps you should take. And this, you should also be really excited at this point, because I'm going to give you an example of some of the better practices that we came up with too. So first, with implementing these practices, our report first and foremost encouraged people to play around and experiment with the better practices. And that's because what works for one group may not work for another, depending on that group's mission or depending on someone's job position. So just being really open and patient with yourself and your team as you play around with what's going to work best for you. And to get things rolling with actually implementing these practices, the first thing that we did was we called out managers and supervisors, team chairs, really anyone in a leadership position to get the ball rolling and to also open up the channels for discussion about these better practices. And when having those discussions, this what gets back to Robin's slide deck for talking points with how to have these discussions. So we really encourage people, especially people in leadership, like I just said, to have these facilitated group discussions, because some people might not be in a position where they feel like they can make recommendations to change these better practices. And again, you're gonna hear us repeat this a lot. So we talked about feedback as one big theme for these better practices. And another is just experimenting with these. Again, being patient with yourself, having empathy for your colleagues, and trying to figure out what works best for you and your group. So let's take a look at some of these practices right now. As Robin mentioned, one was setting team norms. And rather than providing specific guidance and a checklist of what to do, for setting team norms for a meeting, we focused on asking open-ended questions because we recognize that what works for one group may not work for another. So we asked questions related to expectations and ground rules and making decisions. And this could include things, but isn't limited to things like, how are you going to record the minutes? Or what are your Zoom norms? Cameras always on, cameras off, mix and match, free for all. What does your group want to do? And also, how will decisions be made within this group? Another example that we started implementing in our libraries is focus time. And as the name suggests, this is a big calendar block where you dedicate time to work on something that requires a little more attention and would really benefit from less interruptions. And Friday afternoons within our libraries now is considered a meeting-free time, at least within the libraries, so that it could be some dedicated focus time. A better practice embedded within focus time was if you are scheduling a meeting and you see that someone has focus time on their calendar, get their permission before scheduling over that. And as you've heard us talk about meeting culture a lot, meetings are really big within our libraries. So we decided to adapt these a little bit and take some of the functionality of Google Calendars to help us with this. So previously our norm was to have hour-long meetings, let's say from 3 to 4, but we decided to suggest that meetings end about 10 minutes before the hour. So for example, at 3:50, because this would allow people working remotely to either have a bio break or at least get a break from the screen for a few minutes. So they could get their head ready or just, take a little me time before the next thing that they're diving into. And if you weren't aware of this, on Google Calendars, there's actually a speedy meeting feature so that you can automatically make your meetings shorter by default.
So here's how we shared our set of recommendations. First, we shared it on our intranet. We used Confluence. And on the right, you'll see a screenshot of what that looked like. And it was really important for us that we make these easy to dive into. So not like a 40-page PDF that all staff are expected to read, but rather something that is nonlinear. So you can dive into the section that interests you the most. Maybe you want to read about inclusive meeting behaviors first. And we also emphasized making it easy to skim, easy to read, something written for the web, not necessarily printed out and held in your hands. One of the cool things that our library does, as Hillary mentioned before, is that monthly Share with a Peer session open to all library staff. So we held one of those sessions to introduce our best practices and to get staff feedback. And I think over 40 of our colleagues attended, which was really nice to see. So this was a chance for us to demonstrate our practices in action, like having a chat moderator, and also, again, to share some highlights and ask for feedback. This ended up being a really great session. Our colleagues were very engaged and had feedback that was both positive and constructive. Finally, our library director, Greg Raschke, encouraged everyone to take a look at our recommendations, sending an all-staff email linking to them on Confluence. So the recommendations from the Collaborative and Remote Work Task Force Round 1 were influential in moving the needle on internal library meeting culture. So a major part of that impact was due to that email and endorsement from library readership, especially about these recommendations. Scheduling short meetings, sharing meeting agendas in advance, having libraries-wide meeting-free time on Friday afternoons, having 12 meeting-free days per year, and using calendar time blocking if possible. So we found that messaging from the top about worklist recommendations is critical for these types of culture changes. So having our leaders endorse and then model these practices communicated to staff at all levels that adopting these same practices is not only okay, but it's the expectation of our organization.
All right, so Kevin and I are going to be talking about the Collaborative and Remote Work Task Force Round 2, our transition to a hybrid workplace. So the work of the Task Force Round 2 started in about April 2021. Hillary, if you could go to the next slide, please. And we were encouraged to review the original task force report and think about how those recommendations for a remote work environment might translate or be adapted to a hybrid work environment where there would be a mix of people on site, working from home or other location, working in disparate work locations, so not just remotely. And then the remainder of recommendations were so our focus was, again, sort of going back to the meeting culture and how that might be adapted for a hybrid work situation. But again, there were also probably a number of areas from the original recommendation set that the group would look at to see if we could expand them or change them to modify them to adapt to a hybrid work environment. And additionally, there might be areas that the group should examine that were gaps in the original recommendation set. So when our team first met, we talked a little bit about, or maybe a lot about, sort of the hyperdense Zoom meeting days, which I'm sure we all experienced right at the beginning of the pandemic. And then additional challenges of scheduling and calendaring when we have colleagues who have different work hours and different work locations. But one of our very first tasks was to settle on the dates of the 12 meeting-free days. And we talked a lot about this and kind of realized that we needed to accommodate our colleagues who have not sort of the typical 9 to 5 Monday through Friday work schedule, that we really need to be cognizant that for folks in the library, people have really different work schedules and work patterns. And to take that into account, we really focused on just scheduling those meeting-free days from Tuesdays through Thursdays. And where we landed was really just trying to bookend those meeting-free days on either at the end of breaks or campus breaks. So we made that recommendation early on and sent that up to administration. Then how we went about delivering crafting our recommendations is we released an initial very early draft of recommendations around meetings and around calendaring, and Hillary shared those all with all library staff in June. And in July, we created a full draft recommendation, including things beyond those 2 areas, and again, released sort of a draft recommendation set for our colleagues to look at, provide feedback and commentary, and then the final report was released in October. And you'll see that we had some sort of revisited some areas from the original report and expanded into some new areas of recommendation. And so we'll now go take a sneak peek of what our revised recommendations were. And one of the first areas we looked at was meetings again and meeting alternatives. And the group really asked team leads, supervisors, meeting organizers to really take a hard look at their meetings and think about if an actual face-to-face or Zoom meeting was necessary, and if the work that they needed to accomplish could be done in alternate ways. And we provided some suggestions about alternate meeting formats, email, asynchronous documents that people could collaborate on, utilizing chat or Slack for sort of quick communications, or just doing a conference call or phone call instead of a face-to-face meeting, just in recognition that people were getting Zoomed meeting out. Again, as Hillary mentioned earlier, we recognize that not everyone is in a position to make a recommendation or a decision on whether to hold a person, and what form the meeting should take. And so we did encourage, again, that there be open lines of communication between supervisors or team leads and the team meeting, the attendees, to see if there were other ways or better ways to hold the meeting. So again, really an emphasis on having lines of communication and starting the conversation so that people feel free to contribute their thoughts about meeting culture and meeting alternatives. Beyond having the meeting, the group made some recommendations on the mode of meeting in a hybrid work environment. Next slide, please, Hillary. And where we landed, oops, sorry. If you could go back one, where we landed was that because of our hybrid situation, not only people being on site or off site, but also in our library, as with many other libraries, our physical locations are disparate. So we have folks that are on site in Hill and on site in Hunt, which are two sides of the campus, but we also have branch libraries. So not everybody can be in the same physical space at the same time easily, even if we wanted to be. So we came down on the recommendation that the better practice would be for everyone to join a remote meeting individually from their own laptop. And the thinking behind this was that this provides the most equitable meeting experience for all attendees. When we think about a hybrid, or when we were talking about a hybrid meeting, what we were thinking of was where there's a group of folks all together in a conference room, and then some other folks that are joining individually from their own laptop all in an online meeting space. And I think we've probably all experienced that scenario, and sometimes that scenario is not so great. Sometimes the technology in the conference meeting room isn't working great. We have either no sound or horrible reverb. There's also just the issue of the online participants may all have access and be seeing it and able to interact with chat, but the on-site participants may not all have their laptops with them, so may not all be able to participate in a chat, or the on-site participants can have sort of sidebar conversations or conversations where the online participants can't hear what's being said. So there's just sort of a disparate or different differing experiences in a hybrid meeting for the participants. And additionally, the meeting organizer sort of has a higher bar of managing that hybrid meeting experience to try and ensure that all the participants have their same experience. So be that having to monitor chat while also possibly trying to lead the meeting, or ensuring that any questions that the online participants are asking are getting communicated to the group. So there's just sort of this level of meeting management that is more, it's just more work for that meeting organizer. Of course, that's not to say that our recommendation says, only online meetings all the time. We recognize that there's times when, due to the nature of the meeting or what you might want to accomplish at the meeting, a different kind of meeting format is better. It's perhaps better to meet in person if there's sensitive information to be shared, or if there's a need for the group to for the meeting organizer to read body language or get reactions in a different way that's not always possible in an online meeting. Also, again, there may be times when the group itself would prefer to meet in person, or sometimes you have to meet hybrid. There's maybe no other choice. So again, opening up lines of communication about how the group prefers to meet, what their preferred option is, again, is a recommendation from the group. And then we come to calendar management, and generally just some better practices so that our calendars are shared for the whole library, so our colleagues can know where we are and sort of when we are. So in terms of getting in contact with other people, it's very helpful to know, oh, so-and-so works 8 to 5, I'm logged online at 7:30, I know I'm not going to get an answer from them until later in the day. So again, leveraging Google Calendar features, which if you haven't guessed by now, we are definitely a Google shop. So leveraging some of the features in Google to provide your work hours, to provide your work location, is definitely helpful for creating that environment where we're collaborating and sort of all including each other in our communications. The other recommendation we had was about, again, with meetings, is to remind everyone to accept or decline meetings as soon as you can. That way it allows the meeting organizer to reschedule or find alternate ways to provide you that information. And that way just sort of makes calendar management and meeting management a little bit easier if we're all being proactive in that way. And now I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Kevin.
Thanks. So with the move to hybrid work, the experience of being a new hire in an organization can be vastly different. And so we've outlined a few recommendations around how to onboard new staff in a hybrid setting. So the key takeaways here are that things should be more structured, and there should be even more communication than when onboarding in person. So on this slide, you can see a sample calendar for somebody's first week of work. So notice that there are a lot of events with different formats, but it also still tries to be respectful of Zoom fatigue and incorporates a lot of breathing room. You can see that there are a mix of one-on-one meetings, group meetings, as well as informal chances to meet colleagues and more structured training sessions and project overviews. So with hybrid onboarding, we recommend that the supervisor and the new hire are both in person on the first day that they start. So this may be necessarily anyway, logistically, with picking up equipment and things like that, other in-person HR onboarding requirements. But we also think it's valuable for a supervisor and a new employee to get face-to-face time and to be available throughout the day for questions, tours, introductions, etc. So we also recommend that sometime during the new hire's first week that there be an in-person meeting with the team or department that they're a part of. And so this time can be used for things like general introductions, icebreakers, other social time. And as a supervisor of somebody being onboarded in a hybrid setting, you should be extra present on chat and email during the first few weeks. So we know that communication needs to be more intentional when we're working remotely, and that there aren't chance encounters in the hallway or walking over someone's desk to ask a question or things like that. So check in on your staff, on your new staff often, to see if they have any questions or they otherwise want to chat. Setting up informal chances for the new hire to meet others in the department and collaborators across the organization is something that we've done when we worked in person, but it's more important for the supervisor to get these scheduled in a hybrid setting. Hybrid work means that even when people are in the office, it'll still be quieter than usual. Most meetings will still happen online, especially if you're following our recommendations. So it'll be harder to develop these relationships organically. So get more of these meetings on the books for your new staff and connect them with colleagues across the organization early. And finally, provide more documentation. So traditionally, a lot about the culture and practices of a department and organization is shared through meetings and talking with others. So record this information and share it with new hires. Some things that we've done in departments across our organization is creating things like team handbooks, which includes information about departmental cultures, practices, and projects. Newbie docs, which includes information that someone new to the team or department would want to or need to know. README files about each team member, which could include information about what they work on, their interests, their preferred communication styles, and really anything else that they want to share. So once we finished our final report, similarly to our first report, we posted it on our library's intranet, and we shared a link to it in a library-wide email. We also presented about our recommendations in another share with a peer swap session over Zoom where all library staff were invited. And since releasing our second report, we've started seeing people implement the recommendations that we made around meetings and calendar management. We've also heard that people have found the hybrid onboarding best practices useful, especially as hiring restrictions have been lifted and we're starting to hire at an accelerated pace. We've heard from multiple people across the libraries and the university who are interested in sharing our recommendations document more broadly outside of the libraries. Members of our team have also given presentations across campus about our recommendations and around hybrid meeting best practices. So really just a lot of uptake so far, but now I'm going to pass it back to Hillary to wrap up.
Doing some spoiler alerts and jumping ahead too soon with some of these slides. Yeah, so that's a brief overview of how we came up with these better practices and also a sample of some of the better practices that we actually developed. So I also want to acknowledge everyone who's been a part of these teams at any point with both iterations of the group. And also a big thank you to everyone in our libraries who has helped give feedback on these recommendations. And if you all decide that you want to take a look at these and you have suggestions, or you just want to discuss how things have been working at your libraries, we would love to hear from you. So if you are interested in snagging the final report that we made, which touches on everything that we've talked about in really great detail and more. So it is very lengthy, 70+ pages. Don't be overwhelmed. You can search through the document. There's a link for you. It's on a Creative Commons license, so you can use it, share it, adapt it however you want, as long as it's not for commercial purposes. And hopefully one of my colleagues will also drop that link into the chat. And that being said, that wraps up our session. So we would love to take some questions from you all. Amy, has anything popped up in the chat?
Nothing at the moment.
Okay, we're getting some positive feedback from people. Thank you all for your kind words. Okay, so we have a question from Kim Allen, and the question asks, what did you find were people's preferences for camera on versus camera off? I feel like this is the biggest question we get about meetings, to be totally honest. And it's not the best answer people like to hear, but it really depends on the team. So ultimately what we've kind of come up with as a group to recommend, if you are in a situation where your team decides to have cameras on, and then someone has their camera off, just trust them that there's a good reason why. Like maybe they have unstable internet connection that day, or maybe they're in a physical space that they don't really want to show, like they're calling from their car, or we've seen a lot of people who have kids literally crawling on them during meetings, and maybe they don't want all of their colleagues to see that. So if someone has their camera off, trust that there's a good reason why. We have another question. I'm just seeing these as they pop up, so I apologize for not going in order, but have you considered using Trello for helping plan onboarding? This might be a good question for Kevin or Robin.
Yeah, so I don't think we recommended that specifically, but I have heard of colleagues using Trello for that purpose. And, I think that is a great recommendation. It would be a great tool to kind of keep track of everything going on. So yeah, no, that's a great suggestion.
Okay, we got another Kevin question, I think. The hybrid onboarding has been really popular. Let me see, let me scroll up a little bit. So with the staff onboarding for the first week, you mentioned the first day that their meetings with supervisors should be one-on-one on site. Do you have staff that work fully remote? And if they do you still recommend that they come in for their first day?
Yeah, I mean, so our department works primarily remote, or a lot of people in our department do. And as a supervisor, I think I would still ask an employee to come in on their first day for one-on-one if I were, the one doing the onboarding. I know that, with if people live in different locations that are like further away from the office, that might complicate things a little bit. So I don't know, in that case, what we would ask, but certainly if they lived within reasonable commuting distance, I think coming into the office would be beneficial.
Okay, we have another question. Has any aspect of this been carried over into recruitment and hiring to make the process more inclusive? Short answer, yes. And it's funny you ask that because our recruitment and hiring aficionado, Tarita Anatache, she's also in this session right now. And I don't want to call on a guest member to speak to that, but Tarita, would you feel uncomfortable unmuting, or should we say join your session later? Okay, I'll pause, but I encourage you to check out Tarita's session later because I believe they are going to talk a little bit about this within the meeting. But I know that with our recruitment, we're primarily doing, not recruitment, but actual interviews. They're primarily happening over Zoom right now. So we're giving people different modes for participating, which also provides different ways to ask questions and engage with your colleagues. And you can do things like participate on chat versus speaking. So that's coming into a lot of the ways that we're doing the actual interviews. Tarita said she is switching computers right now, but she would be happy to chat about it. So I don't know if that means she's able to hop in on these last 3 minutes to speak to that.
I will add two things that were sort of concurrently recommended for our meeting practices and hybrid practices and more inclusive meeting practices is turning on Zoom's live captions, especially for larger meetings or for interviews taking place over Zoom. Those are great ways to be more inclusive, especially if people, are in a place where there's a lot of noise or they might be hard of hearing. And so having those captions on just by default, as opposed to asking the participant or the interviewee to request that, is a great way to be more inclusive. And something else that Hilary might have also mentioned is for those all day academic interviews that now might be taking place on Zoom, to be building in lots of breaks and buffer times in between each of those sessions. We mentioned before that we like having shorter meetings, speedy meetings, and we use the same practices for our interviews as well.
Yeah, can folks hear me? This is Tarita, sorry. Speaking of random things, I think Robin and the rest of the crew really touched on a lot of it between the live captioning and really being mindful about how much time we are using for an interview, which certainly can be carried over to when we go things in person. Like, do we really need to meet for an entire hour for this particular session and stuff? But somewhat similarly, some other things that we do in terms of equity and inclusion in our recruiting and our interviewing in particular is making sure that they have as equitable an experience across the board. So for instance, I know a lot of folks are already thinking about, oh, do we want to do some in person and some online? And we need to make sure that, if we choose in an online version, that we need to do that across the board, right? So everybody has the same experience. Making sure that we have questions ahead of time that we provide to candidates, and also that we know the order in which we're going to say them and that it remains consistent the whole time, just so we can provide as smooth a process. And there's more that I could probably talk about, but I don't want to necessarily co-opt all of this wonderful session. And thanks for the invitation to speak up in my rather odd situation right now.
I feel like we could go on and on. This usually tends to be a very active session when we get questions. So we're happy to, if you have groups within your libraries that you want us to speak to, we're happy to join in on that. I know we're at time right now, so feel free to reach out to any one of us or look at the report. We would be happy to chat more at any point with you all. And thank you for being here.